You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright, don't you?
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and today I'm talking with Carolyn Clement, an award-winning family photographer, mother of two, and a survivor of therapy, child, and sibling abuse, and Amy Avalon, who is a retired private practice therapist and a passionate advocate for survivors of sexual and emotional abuse by their therapist. She helps raise awareness of widespread unethical conduct and abuse in psychotherapy field. I just want to take a moment to let people know that we're going to talk about some difficult material. It's about emotional, sexual, and even physical abuse at the hands of one's therapist. The content may be triggering, and we ask folks to do what they need to do to take care of themselves during this hour. Just to sort of introduce this topic, I want to go back as far as Freud, because Freud started out something that actually has carried on to today that causes a lot of problems for people who are being exploited by their therapist. And what he did was he claimed that sexual abuse survivors were unable to discern between truth and fantasy, and appointed therapists to do so on their clients' behalf. And of course, Freud is long dead and buried, but that particular idea has persisted. So when a client comes forward and complains or discloses an assault by their therapist, be it sexual or emotional or physical, they experience an uphill battle getting police, victim services, and even sexual assault centers to hold the professional accountable, because in part, the therapist has been given the power to define their client's reality. Mm-hmm. So most of us who start therapy are not aware when we walk in what ethical boundaries are that our therapists must adhere to. We are also told to trust the therapist and to tell them our fears and secrets. And if we have difficulty doing that, we're often told to jump out of our comfort zone, and that our inability to trust is neurotic, and thus the therapist is there to help us. And while that trust is an absolute necessity within the healing process, it is also the thing an unethical therapist will take advantage of and exploit. So the three of us, Amy, Carolyn, and myself, are going to chat about our collective experiences dealing with unethical therapists who caused us harm. And as Amy said, there is a widespread unethical conduct happening in the psychotherapy field. That harm often leaves their clients in a worse place than when they started therapy. And hopefully, in doing this chat with all you folks, it's our hope that you will gain valuable information about what is and isn't okay in therapy, and what to do if it is happening to you or someone you know, and where to go to get support. Language makes this issue very difficult to find information around exploitation by therapists, and many people who reach out to tell, an organization both Amy and I are involved in and volunteer to support other survivors globally. They describe an agonizing process of trying to find help for what they are going through. So our inadequate language makes it difficult to find help. So I'm going to give you resources at the end of this program. So when you have a moment, go and get your paper and pens. So welcome, Amy and Caroline.
Thank you, Bernadine.
Hello, thank you.
I just want to make sure, Caroline, I'm saying your name right. It's not Carolyn, or it's Caroline?
It's Carolyn.
Carolyn, thank you. Thank you for letting us know that. So both of you have experienced exploitation, abuse at the hands of your therapist. No, but for Carolyn, it is your therapist. For myself, it was my therapist. But for Amy, I believe it was your colleague. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct. It was a colleague that I knew and just really adored and respected for over 15 years. I had actually even, been through training with him, someone that I thought I knew very, very well. Through the years, as we worked together, there was a lot of gaslighting going on that I couldn't quite put my finger on because I didn't have enough understanding of really what was going on. And it was so subtle. And like much of therapy abuse, it happens very subtly, like water on a rock. So you don't really know. And then I later discovered that he was sexually abusing a patient. And so I had to intervene and take the steps to try to stop that. And it really turned my life upside down.
So how did you find out he was sexually assaulting a client?
He actually told me.
He told you?
He actually told me, yes. I think that's another part of this I would later find out that this was not his first offense. And as the years go by, a lot of these abusers, most of them, the vast majority, are serial abusers, while the vast majority of victims believe that they are the only one that this is happening to. That's usually not the case. But there were other victims, but he had grown in his arrogance because no one had ever come forward. No one had ever called it abuse. No one had ever held him accountable. And so he told me thinking that, maybe I'd even be happy for him that he found someone that he cared about. He also, said that he was helping this client. That's also very common in this issue. And he was absolutely shocked when I immediately said, I will be taking action immediately. And
how long? Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. How long do you think he was abusing his clients? Over what kind of time frame?
I mean, to answer that question in the way that I'd like to is I don't think that these people ever don't abuse in some way in all of their relationships. It's sort of like, this is the way that they interact. And so there are different levels of severity and there are different kinds of relationships. But he was abusive in his relationship with me, just as a colleague. He was abusive in his sibling relationships. He was abusive in his previous career with his other business partners. He was abusive to the person at the parking attendant, subtly and not so subtly. But I really think that this was pretty much just how he was oriented to the world. And I think that that's true of the vast majority of the abusers who are therapists, and that's why they don't feel like they need to be held accountable, because they don't really, this is just how they work with people. It's always a power differential and it's always a power grab for them. Most of us seek harmony and mutual benefit in our relationships. The abuser is always seeking power over and taking.
And it's also interesting when you said serial abuser, because as you describe that, of course, I'm thinking child molesters, serial rapists, batterers, it's not uncommon that people who abuse do so in a serial way. Carolyn, what happened for you?
Well, I decided to go see a therapist. I wanted to work on my childhood issues that were coming up. I was a mother to a young child, and I thought this was a great time for me to address some of the issues that I had or patterns that were coming up. And so I went to therapy, and that's where everything started out okay, until at one point I started having these feelings where it was just really nice to be in a space where someone was kind and giving me a lot of attention and just very supportive. And that attention and that directed towards me made me have these warm and fuzzy feelings. And so I had gone online and checked what to do about it, and everything suggested that it could be helpful in therapy. And so even though I was embarrassed and it was difficult to bring it up, I did tell my therapist that I was having these feelings of transference. And I believe that from that moment on, I was no longer, he was pulling the strings at that point. I was no longer able to make decisions on my own. So I was in therapy with him for only 4 months. And I think I started mentioning transference within the first 2. And then he slowly started introducing it into every subsequent session. So what happened is I cried in a session with him, and I became very uncomfortable. I do not like showing emotion. I don't like being looked at. And I remember he was just staring at me so intensely. And I remember saying, well, don't just stare at me, because I was crying and I felt very awkward. And then because I was embarrassed, I said something along the lines of, it's probably, it's like a mating thing, or I feel uncomfortable like under your gaze while I'm crying. Like, I don't like that. And so the next time that I had a session with him, he said, why don't we talk about that? Let's bring it up. And so I really was trying to dismiss it and say, it's okay. I just think it's a really warm and fuzzy place to be here. I enjoy coming. And that's when he started, I thought it was subtle at the time. Now I don't think it was very subtle, but he would start disclosing more about himself, and telling me that I was objectively attractive, talented, creative, smart, bright. So he was absolutely showing me that he was interested in me. And I remember telling him, well, actually, I don't want to get off topic, but he would ask me at the end of a session, if there was anything that I would do with him, what I would want to experience with him. He told me that he would bring me to Pittsburgh, which is where he was from, and the things that he would do with me. He would bring me to a museum, the Andy Warhol Museum, because I'm an artist, and that he would bring me to a hotel. And this was all in session. And then he asked me what I would want to do with him. And I remember fumbling through what I would do in my hometown, because I have no idea. So as the sessions were going on, he would move from the therapist chair over to his desk chair. So it's almost as though he was creating a boundary, or making it seem like, now the therapy is over. Why don't we just talk friend to friend? Or and that's when he would extend the sessions as well. So by the last month, I remember, and it was only once a month, so it happened really quickly. We were definitely eating into the next session's time. And eventually he told me that I was done therapy. And this was very sudden and abrupt. And I did not see it coming, because I definitely felt like I had more therapy to do, still so much more to unpack about everything I'd been through. And I got really upset with him, because I felt like he was abandoning me in the same way that I had been abandoned as a child. And it hurt me so much, because again, I thought we were having a good rapport in therapy. And I just felt like, what have I done that he suddenly no longer wants to see me, even for 50 minutes a week? So I got really upset. And I remember I sent an email and I said that he was fired, that I couldn't believe that he would do this to me. And he was so tone deaf, because it's exactly what I had experienced. And he ended up telling me to answer his call a few days later. And when I answered the call, the first thing that he said to me was, I am in love with you. And I gasped, and I had no idea that that's what he was going to say. And I also feel like at that point, I was married. I had a child, and now I had this incredible secret, this tremendous pressure on me, or burden, that I either would have to say something to my husband or say something about the therapist and get him in trouble. And at the same time, I also feel like I really am falling in love with this person. Like I thought, if he's a therapist and he's counseled so many relationships, if he says that this is unlike anything else that he's ever had, he must mean it. And therefore, I am willing to take the chance of ending my marriage and exploring that. And so everything just fell apart from that moment. And
So can I just stop you there, Carolyn? Are you saying this all happened within a 4-month period?
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
You also said you saw him once a month. Is that what you meant to say? Or because that would mean 4 sessions.
No, I'm sorry. It was 4 times in a month.
4 times. So
yeah.
once a week. Yes. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting from that is that he brought you along to a certain point and then abandoned you. You reacted to the abandonment. And then he sort of came back, in a one fell swoop with, I'm in love with you. And so even, feeling, the way to fix not feeling abandoned is by engaging with him in this other way, just to keep yourself okay.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and I felt so wanted. I felt so like the fact that he would risk everything. He obviously must have meant it. It had to have been something that was real and not deliberate. And now I realize it was deliberate. So.
Yes. Yeah. We have to take a break. I can't believe I have to say that. And just sort of, end this part of the conversation right here, but we just need to take a little break, folks. So don't go away. We'll come right back.
Hi, this is Tom Lavin of the legendary Powder Blues. We'll be appearing live on Sunday, May 15th at the Rio Theatre, Broadway and Commercial, in a benefit concert supporting our great Vancouver co-op radio station, CFRO 100.5 FM. For tickets, go to riotheatretickets.ca or powderblues.net. All proceeds to Vancouver Co-op Radio, the legendary Powder Blues, and special guests Harris and Debray. Be there or be square.
Side of town.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and today we're talking with Carolyn Clement and Amy Avalon about the impact of exploitation by therapists on their client. So Carolyn, you were talking about how, you had the warm and fuzzies and he was saying all these wonderful things. And certainly in my case, people know that this has been a part of my experience. That kind of love bombing happened all the time. I was brilliant. I was so amazing. I worked so hard in therapy. I was so insightful and in touch and blah, blah, blah. But for me, you're talking 4 months. With me, it was 8 years before the subtle sexual contact actually ended up with sexual intercourse. And so up until that point, I just thought, so what, that kind of happens. Sexual tension is a part of relationships. I'll just ignore it. Doesn't really mean anything. And I think also because my therapist was female, I didn't read the cues in the same way I would have had she been male. So when she paid for me to go to a conference with her in Orange County, California, we traveled from Vancouver to there, and she booked all the travel arrangements. And when we got there, she had booked one room with one bed in it. Now, if she'd have been a man, I would have gone, oh, I know what this is. I can read all of this. And I would have addressed it. But because she was female, I just assumed that, she was, this is what women do. They just hang out together like this. And I shouldn't be so paranoid and uptight about it. So I just slept on the couch. But I also want to go back to that only person thing, because certainly I got that message as well, that you're the only person that I would do this with. I've never done this before. It's just that you're so special and you're so brilliant and you're so blah, blah, that I'm, willing to put my own career on the line because you're so special. And of course, that also goes back to child molesters and, the whole thing they do about telling their victims that they are special and they don't do this with anybody else and blah, blah, blah. It's so interesting to me, the parallels between the different kinds of people out there who are exploiting people and how similar their patterns of grooming are.
Mm-hmm.
So Amy, sorry, somebody was going to speak.
Oh, wait, I was just agreeing with you. That similarity in the patterns. Yeah.
Yeah. So Amy, when you finally went and you reported him, what happened? You were colleagues. If I'm right, you worked out of the same office?
We did. And I unfortunately, in the ethics codes that govern my license in the state, we're required to try to intervene. This is a code I wholly disagree with. We're required to try, when there's an ethics breach with a colleague, you try to intervene with them on a more informal level before it escalates. And that put me in a really vulnerable position because it shouldn't be my job to decide whether or not this person's fit to practice. And it shouldn't be my job to try to stop them from doing, which is something that is a felony in half the states. It wasn't in the state where I was working, it was strictly prohibited. And so I spoke to my supervisors and 2 attorneys, and they gave me a whole script of what to say. And I would say that's where you see a lot of that similar grooming happening. Oh my gosh, I really care about you. You're, I want to make you, I just want to reassure you. You're really brilliant. You've been such a good friend to me. I want to be there,
Mm-hmm.
So he just really worked hard to try to get me to believe that I wasn't seeing what I was seeing.
Right.
And, but then, as is often the case with abusers, once they realize that you're not going to, that I wasn't going to be silent about this. I remember him saying to me, once when I said, I think you should report yourself. I think you should go get some help and, report yourself and see what could happen from that. And he just yelled at me, Amy, nobody ever has to find out about this. And I just said, but I already know, like, I can't not take any action on this.
Right.
I just was trying to, at that point, I still had the cognitive dissonance. It's like finding out that your family member is a child molester.
Right.
And I'm thinking, there must be something I don't understand here.
Right.
Are you really lonely? What's going on? It was too hard for me to take that he was just, he'd planned this out from the beginning. And then when I tried to do as much as I could, but he just became more and more threatening, having lawyers sending me, letter after letter. And then I finally had it. I even had to get the police involved, and I eventually did make my report to the state, which I wish I had done right away.
Right.
Because I was afraid to make the report, but that's when my healing started, and that's when my relief started, because then I had a board who was validating that what I saw was completely wrong, that what I was doing of reporting him was completely right. And then it protected me from retaliation in a way that I wasn't protected before I reported. I'm not saying that this is true for everybody who reports,
right?
But at least then it's like the secret's out, it's going to be public record. Now he had to contend with a bigger enemy, right? And a more important one than little me.
But even I ask you why you were afraid to report him?
I was afraid that I wouldn't be believed.
Wow. And you were a therapist reporting your another colleague.
Yes.
And
I was
still you had that fear.
Yeah. And I was afraid that it would backfire on me. A lot of my colleagues said, just get away from this, just get as far away from it as you can, because this could really hurt you. And that's true. It did. I had to move my offices twice.
Wow.
I had to, there's some unique situations that happened with my situation that aren't important to go into right now, but it's just, I lost pretty much everything. My husband and I actually moved 500 miles away eventually.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So what I'm also hearing is that a lot of colleagues are knowing this about their colleagues and not necessarily reporting them.
Absolutely not. And you know, it's one of the reasons that I left the field is I was shocked at how little support I got and how much sympathy he got.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, to me, it's the equivalent of rape. And and I understand too, none of us were trained in how to handle this. And they were struggling with the cognitive dissonance too, of this person who did, he was not the type of person you would ever imagine would have been doing this.
Right.
And so I think they just couldn't tolerate it either. Like, this guy that I really like, who I've been referring to for years, you're telling me he's done this, and it was one of the worst cases that the board had ever seen. So even, just how sordid it was, how much he had abused his power, how vulnerable the client was. It just was so much to bear. So I was afraid that, like, was I overreacting? Was I too harsh?
Yes.
There's so much self-doubt after all those years of gaslighting.
Yeah.
And then when your own colleagues are saying, I had one colleague who said, these things happen. And I said, no, they don't. No, they don't. I mean, they don't just happen. It's a series of calculated choices on the part of that therapist every time.
When it happened to me, the person that was my abusive therapist, she was a female, which makes it hard to begin with. But she was also somebody very well known in the city of Vancouver. She was the first she had been around for eons. So she was the first director of the first transition house for battered women in Vancouver. She co-founded the first organization to support children who had been sexually abused in Vancouver. She designed and facilitated the first sexual abuse courses for therapists and police in Vancouver through our Justice Institute, which does all the training here. She was in CAR 86 when it started, which here in Vancouver is the combination of a police officer and a mental health worker who go out on mental health calls. And she was known as an expert on sexual abuse with children and started working with people who were severely traumatized and dissociative really early on here. And so it was very well known. She was, so when it was happening with me, it's kind of the same. It was like, I don't think I believed it. I mean, she would literally say to me, and this was the entire conversation. She said, well, we have a dual relationship. And I'd say, yeah. And she said, well, and we know it's transference and, we can talk about that, transference and counter. Yeah. And she said, okay, so then we're all okay. We're fine. And, so in my mind, she had covered the bases. And so we must be fine because she was the therapist and she was making these decisions. And it wasn't until we not only went into a committed relationship, we bought a house together. We bought a house together that had 3 suites. We lived in different suites. And so we tried to create the illusion that we weren't living together, even though we were. And by the time I separated from her, we're still not getting it that this was really a bad thing that had happened to me. I still didn't really comprehend the importance of how many of her clients and ex-clients were coming in and out of this property. They were everywhere. It was so normalized. What she had done was so normalized that she had clients coming in and painting for her, and another client coming in and rewiring parts of her suite, and another client coming in and helping to put up a fence. And another one came and walked her dog, and another one it was just this onslaught of clients coming in and out. It was so normalized. And when I finally sat down and wrote down all the names of her friends, every one of them was either a client, an ex-client, or an ex-employee. And the only alternative to that was a woman who later I found out had been accused of, quite legitimately accused of sleeping with her son's teenage friends when she was 40. And Pam was one of the people that supported her during that whole event. And so it just was really interesting to see that that was her only way of having relationships, was where she was in a position of power. So
if I can just jump in.
Sure.
It's interesting. My therapist, he specializes in ethical boundaries in therapy relationships, and he has authored books. And
yes,
I actually reached out to tell because I had wondered if anyone filed a lawsuit against him. So I was Googling his name and then law, and it came out that he had just done a presentation at a law and ethics conference, and he's presenting about the same stuff that he has been doing. Like, it was so
wow.
Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. I put it together that this man who I thought the same thing, I allowed it. It did go on for 7 years. It wasn't just the 4 months. It ended up,
okay.
Right. It ended up going on for a very long time. And that's when
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that they will put themselves in that position. The thing that I did was I left the relationship believing that nobody would believe me. I was the client. She was this big person, and she attacked. The moment I started separating from her and moving on with my life, she attacked me, and I still didn't get it. That what was going on. I just couldn't understand why she'd gone from seeing me as this brilliant, bright, amazing, incredible person to somebody that it was okay to treat in the way that she was now treating me. And the abuse was so significant. I eventually did talk to another one of her clients who she started targeting after me, and creating that same kind of relationship. And she said that when she was trying to get away from Pam, she did it very differently because she saw what Pam had done to me and she didn't want that to happen to her. It was so, it literally brought me to the point of suicide every day of my life for over a year. That I just sat with the idea of suicide every day for a year because I had no way of understanding what had gone on or why, and why it was impacting me in such a big way. But anyway, so, but I stayed quiet for 15 years, I think it was 15 years. And it wasn't until the Sexual Assault Center here in Vancouver was going to put on an event to honor her as a feminist icon that I saw that one of my friends, somebody I knew, was going to co-sponsor this event, that I had to call her and say, you do not want to do this. This is going to bite you later. And I disclosed, and it was kind of the first time that I had disclosed this to anyone. Really, I had tried before to report her to her association, mostly because I saw what she was doing with this other client, and I knew that other client was already suicidal, and I just knew it wasn't okay. And she ended up. We have this little glitch here in Vancouver, BC, where unless you're with the College of Physicians and Surgeons or the College of Psychiatrists or Psychologists, and you're just with an association, a professional association, there literally is nothing they can do to hold somebody accountable. And so once I handed in all my evidence of this really inappropriate relationship, all she had to do was resign her membership. And the file was closed and the investigation was done. And so there just didn't seem to be any way to hold her accountable up here at all.
Yeah, a lot of them just go on for years and years getting away with this. And I mean, it's just the way that you describe Pam, and certainly you too, Carolyn. I also have observed that a lot of these abusers really work hard to cultivate that spotless image. And it's like this overcompensation so that if they were ever to be questioned, they have built up this whole cushion.
Yes.
And, I do think that is part of the pathology, that it is a deliberate act on their part so that people will not question them when victims come forward, and also so that victims will not feel like they can.
Yes, to put really, I think what you're saying is to put themselves in a position that they are above suspicion, right? So
Yes,
that people will
perfect.
just assume that that couldn't have happened. But of course, we're also dealing with the fact that a therapist has the power to define the reality of their client. And I see that happening over and over and over just on this radio program where, certain people think that they even, that people are talking about that their therapist will define something for them that they absolutely know is not true, but they have no right to say differently because nobody's listening. We just have to take another break, but we'll be right back, folks.
Vancouver Cooperative Radio is an innovative, nonprofit community radio station with a mission to produce creative and engaging programming for communities whose voices are underrepresented in the mainstream media. We need your financial support to help us achieve this mission. By donating today, you will help us to continue to provide training and access to equipment for over 300 volunteers who produce 140 hours of original programming in over 10 languages. Our radio station is located in the heart of the downtown East Side, and since 1975, we have celebrated the rich cultural diversity of the Greater Vancouver area through our arts, music, and spoken word programming. Please support alternative, community-based radio. Donate today by visiting coopradio.org/donate or calling 604-684-8494. That's 604-684-8494.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and we're continuing our conversation with Carolyn Clement and Amy Avalon about the impact of exploitation by therapists on their clients. So Amy and Carolyn, let's talk a little bit about ethical boundaries. Can we name a few of them?
Well, one of the things that Carolyn brought up, and you as well, Bernadine, is just what I call the gateway to grooming, and it's the therapist self-disclosure, and that's something that we learned from our first day of training. The therapy is not about us; it's about the client. So we don't disclose anything personal about ourselves, and usually, when the therapist begins talking about himself or herself themselves, that's when you should really know that there's some red flags.
Right.
That was exactly what happened. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So in therapy, as he started speaking more about himself and his experience, he definitely made sure to let me know that he came from a dysfunctional family and that his background had also been tumultuous like mine. And so I felt a sense of that I could relate to that, and that we were on kind of the same level and had a similar understanding because we grew up in the same way. So at that point, I just wanted to protect him and, take care of him the same way I was hoping to take care of me.
So you became emotionally responsible on some level. One of the things my therapist did was she told me, she wove it into a session somewhere. And there was lots of times where the session would take a turn that wasn't consistent with where the session was going. And so I kind of knew it was something she wanted to say. And one of the things she said was that when she was at her university course, learning to become a social worker and having to go through her own counseling as a part of that, this was on Cold Mountain here in BC, her counselor had to help her deal with her self-image around her own body, told her to take off all her clothes and lie on the floor, and then he commented on her body. But she made me promise before telling me the story that I could never tell anyone, because if I did, he would get into a lot of trouble. And so she told me this really sort of personal story. She made it seem okay that this boundary had been violated, that it had been an appropriate thing, and then led me into a secret and to see whether or not I would keep the secret. It was an incredible form of grooming and testing, but definitely an ethical boundary. I was also brought into her personal life. So it wasn't just personal stories about herself. It was family events and hanging out with her mother and going on errands, doing things outside of therapy a lot, like going for coffee or dinner, things like that.
Also, increase in contact.
Yes.
That's one thing. I mean, I think it's important for us to talk about these subtle ways that start at the beginning, because an increase in contact could mean, texts and emails. Really, email and text should be reserved only for scheduling. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
There should be no clinical exchanges, no personal exchanges. But there's an increase in that, more emails, more texts coming from the therapist at different hours in between sessions, and also the sessions extending beyond the allotted time. And then more frequent contact, more than once a week, more than twice a week, or even more than that is not clinically relevant. Obviously, if you have an acute situation and you need to see your therapist a couple times a week, but usually, whenever I would do that with patients, it was like, we're going to do this just for a certain amount of time to get you through this, and then we'll go back. Because you're always trying to, as a therapist, we're always trying to get them to the end of therapy when they're well and leaving therapy.
Yes.
That is the goal of all therapy, to leave therapy and not need the therapist. And so, that increase of contact is also a red flag.
Yeah. And just to put it into context, that increase in contact it's twofold. One, it creates a dependency on the therapists and an isolation, because the more you're depending on the therapist, the more you're not developing relationships where you can depend on other people in your lives. So that's one thing. But the other part of that contact is that the therapist can constantly check in and make sure that you're not getting it, that maybe something is going awry here that they shouldn't be doing. But that increasing dependency on the therapist, like you said, Amy, the goal of therapy is to leave the client in their own lives and walk out of it as a therapist. So if you're increasing dependency, then what you're doing is entrenching you in somebody's life in a serious way. I would also say that creating a situation where the therapist is involving themselves in making decisions about your relationships outside of therapy. So they should not be telling you who and who you shouldn't be having a relationship with, or impacting. I mean, those things are your decision. And so often I see people where they have been seriously isolated. So by the time the sexual contact goes from, and this is another sort of red flag, is, sexual contact we sometimes think as just sexual intercourse, but sexual contact can be a hand up too high on the leg, or giving somebody a hug way too long, or, all the way up to sexual contact. Even, I think, you guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think, making comments about somebody's body or how they're looking, or that has any sexual context in it at all, is also sexual contact. It's just not physical.
Mm-hmm. Right. And hugging, hugging or touching, just as even friendly hugging and touching, really isn't a part of therapy. Of healthy.
And yet my therapist actually made a point to mention, I'm not going to touch you. I'm keeping my hands to myself when we were in session, as if, see, I'm one of the good ones. I'm not. And actually, another thing that he did with self-disclosure is he spoke about his children a lot. He was married. And this was the thing. It's the back and forth. He just kept promising that in the future, it's just wait a little longer. I'm going to be there. I'm going to do this. And eventually I realized this is just not going to happen. And I'm just being played. And that's when it started making sense. And I wish, I don't want to get ahead, but I wish I had known what abuse looked like from, because I realized that all the relationships that were problematic in my life actually fit the exact same pattern. And that's why I couldn't recognize it when he did it. But as I was doing work with another therapist over several years, that's when I realized that was exactly the issue I had had with my mother and with my brother. And so that's why it felt so familiar.
Yeah, it can feel like that is just normal. I mean, if you come from a lifetime of abuse, that will feel normal, what's going on, but it will feel like somehow you are conquering that issue, right? That you've done well. Like I always thought, well, if my therapist wants to be my friend or my colleague or, my in a committed relationship with me, it means that I have done great work in my healing. And that was one of the hardest things for me to come to, was recognizing that my relationship with her did not mean that I had done a great job in my healing process. It had only meant that I had continued on being a victim. And that was really, really demoralizing for me to recognize at that point. But I think a lot of people don't recognize how serious the impact on clients is. That's all bad grammar in there. But the impact, I mean, so often people say that I am worse now than when I started therapy. And that's because the damage done by therapists is so incredibly profound. They take people in their vulnerable, they get them to trust them, and then they do this exploitation, which is done when the person's defenses are down. They're vulnerable. They are trusting you to help them, and instead they get hurt. And that damage becomes much more profound. I always say that my therapist was my worst predator.
Yes. Bernadine, could I just say two things?
Sure, go ahead.
Just about that. So, number one, there's a reason that those boundaries are there, even from the subtle ones, not fostering dependency, keeping to the time, and no self-disclosure, which seem, like, well, what's the big deal about that? It is a big deal because the harm is significant when therapists do not obey those standards. They're there for a reason, to protect the client. And then the other thing is that I just really want anyone who's listening to know, and that victims of therapy abuse, it has nothing, it can happen to anybody. It often does. And it's not their own issues or vulnerability that are the reason for this abuse and why it's so hard on them. Everyone's vulnerable when they go into therapy, just like everyone's vulnerable on an operating table when they're anesthetized.
Right.
It is the abuser that is 100% to blame and 100% the cause of the harm, because you could have all the same issues, severe trauma, and you go to an ethical therapist and you will heal.
Right.
And it's not because of the client at all. I think it's so important to keep the focus on, that these people are harmful.
Yes.
and they will cause these symptoms in anybody who is treated this way. It doesn't have, you don't have to have anything wrong in your childhood. You can have had, pretty great upbringing, but if you get in this tangle with their grooming and their abuse, you will come out with these symptoms.
Right. And I think also it's important to say that, because this was one of the things that happened for me as I started to disclose, is people would say things like that, well, you had an affair, so what? Or you're sounding like a scorned lover, and it was really hard for me to turn that language around. Yeah, victim blaming. But this isn't an affair. And that person is not the lover. These are sexual assaults, and those people are rapists. And when it comes to sexual assault, emotional impact or the emotional exploitation is maybe a different thing. But for me, my abusive therapist was a rapist, in my opinion.
I agree.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I started realizing at the end was I never gave consent. It was at the very end. I remember at one point I said no to him. I absolutely very clearly said no, and he didn't care. And that's when I realized all along, he just took whatever he wanted and he never was asking for consent. And then I thought, how can I consent to any of this relationship, considering I didn't enter it really with a clear state of mind? So the 7 years was just a mess.
I think there are states, and Amy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are states in the US where consent is not a defense.
That's correct. And in fact, I mean, I think it's pretty much in all of the states, in terms of board and licensure, in terms of the criminal code, that's different state to state.
Right.
But no matter what license you have, any sexual relationship is prohibited, and there isn't, it doesn't matter if the client says, I consented. In my case, the client tried to defend my colleague to the board saying, no, I initiated this. I wanted this. He was the best therapist I ever had. And it's like, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So
right.
That's pretty much across the board in the US.
Yeah. And in Canada, it is in our criminal code that a doctor, somebody in that position of authority, cannot have sex with a client. That is considered abuse. College of Psychiatrists, which is the physicians and surgeons here, they cover psychiatrists, say you can never have sexual contact with a client, a former client, regardless of time. I think in the psychology college, it's 2 years or something like that. It starts to become a gray area. But it really does need to be never, because the relationship between therapist and client, when you factor in transference, et cetera, it really mirrors that of parent and child. So let's talk a little bit about resources. I'm kind of running out of time. Carolyn, you have developed a resource for survivors of exploitation by therapists. Can you tell folks about that briefly?
Absolutely. Yeah. So once I reached out to TEL and started gathering information and realized that it was language that I had been missing out on, I really thought, how can I help how do I prevent it from happening to other people? And I have children. So I have decided to create a website that I would have wanted to have when I was first trying to make sense of everything. And it's www.unethicalboundaries.com. And it's still an ongoing process, but I want to be able to share what my experience has been like, and also connect with other potential victims, and then find ways that we can heal and pass a message on to others. So
right. Thank you. So that's www.unethicalboundaries.com. Did I get that right? Okay, great. And Amy, you and I both volunteer our time for TEL. Maybe you could tell folks what TEL is.
So it's the Therapy Exploitation Link Line, and TEL has been around for decades. It's an email support service as well as a website at www.therapyabuse.org, where you can go. You don't have to reach out to us. You can get a lot of information just coming to our website alone. In fact, I didn't reach out to TEL for a year and a half, but I went to the website frequently just to get validation from all the great articles and resources there. And then, of course, you can certainly send us an email. There are about 12 volunteers of us, and we will do our best to respond to your unique situation with the resources that we feel can help.
And the nice thing about having so many people who do respond to emails that are coming in is that each one of us has a wealth of information, and we come at it from a different perspective or have had a different experience and can offer a great deal from a wide range of people. And of course, people can reach me here at rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. I have created my own checklist. It was one of the things that I did on TEL's website that was a pivotal moment in my life. I had actually went on TEL to do the checklist to prove to myself that even though my relationship had toasted and was a nightmare, it had been special, that what we had was unique and different and one of a kind, and I remember doing that checklist, and box after box after box after box, I was like checking them off until I literally had practically checked off everything on the checklist, and had to recognize that, what had, thrilled me about how my therapist was with me, that whole not gaslighting, but love bombing and everything, was really grooming. And the grooming process for these folks is so similar. So I actually recreated the checklist, and I have it, and I can send it out to anybody. It's free, just like all the resources on TEL are. There's one article after another, and a free ebook for people. So thank you, both of you, for having this conversation. I feel like we just touched on it, like the tip of the surface in this hour.
Thank you so much, Bernadine, for all your
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for coming and having this conversation with me. So just hang on, folks. We'll be right back. And thank you to Carolyn Clement and Amy Avalon for having this conversation.
You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio 100.5 CFRO. We are a non-commercial station bringing you voices and stories and perspectives you probably won't hear elsewhere. We are supported by members and by donations. You can become a member by going to our website at www.coopradio.org. If you like what you hear but don't want to be a member, that's cool too. You can still help by clicking on the donate arrow at the top right of the website. Co-op Radio thanks you for listening and for helping build our community of listeners and programmers.
Do you feel unsafe in your home?
You are not alone.
Transition houses offer free support and shelter for women and children.
We are here for you.
We are here for you.
We are here for you.
Make the call.
1-800-VICTIM-LINK.
1-800-563-0808.
bcsth.ca.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and that's our show for this week. If you find yourself needing resources at this point, don't hesitate to look any of us up. Given the contact information that we already provided, I will also be posting this information on our website under resources. We will be happy to assist you in any way we can. Again, my thanks to Carolyn Clement and Amy Avalon for sharing their stories with me and you all. But most importantly, and as always, my thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
When I can't seem to find my way under or over or through, just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say to be nice. Or somehow when they fall from your lips, I'm convinced you're right. When I'm weary and so tired,